My name is Thayer Rowe. I'm 44 years old, and about 11 months ago I woke up on the concrete floor of my own basement, with my wrists zip-tied behind my back, listening to my wife and a county homicide detective toast each other over a suicide note they had written in my handwriting. Welcome back to Story Lab, where we take the worst night of somebody's life apart slowly, the way you'd take apart an engine, so you can see exactly which piece failed and why. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. A person can be very good at lying to your face. A person can even be good enough to fake your handwriting. But almost nobody is good at lying to a piece of paper that has to add up. And by the end of this, I'm going to show you a free, boring, 5-minute phone call that would have shown me everything they were planning, months before anyone tied my hands. They thought I audited spreadsheets for a trucking company. That was the point. That was 11 years of the point. Nobody looks twice at the quiet man in the beige office who asks about fuel receipts. This is what happened when the quietest man they knew stopped being quiet. Danforth, Missouri, is the kind of river town that looks best from a distance and in bad weather. 40 minutes southwest of St. Louis, folded into the bluffs where the Little Wyandotte runs brown and slow into farmland. 2,900 people, 1 high school, 3 churches, a grain elevator that hadn't taken grain since the 90s, and a stretch of state highway wide enough that trucks used it as a shortcut when the interstate backed up. Thayer Rowe had chosen it the way a sniper chooses a hillside, quietly, and for reasons he never explained to anyone. To the people of Danforth, he was the accountant, senior cost analyst at Ackland Freight Systems, a mid-sized trucking line out of the industrial park on the north edge of town. He wore short-sleeved dress shirts and a brown belt. He drove a gray sedan with 190,000 miles on it, and a cracked cup holder he'd never replaced. He kept a lunch schedule so regular that the woman at the sandwich counter started his order when she saw his car turn in. He was, by every visible measure, the least interesting man in Cargill County. That was the cover. Underneath it, Thayer Rowe was a special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration, assigned to the Financial Investigations Team out of the St. Louis Field Division, and he had spent 11 years reading the money that moved through the American middle of a supply chain that started in the mountains of Sinaloa. He did not kick doors. He had never fired his weapon outside a range. What he did was sit in a beige office with a fluorescent hum and read fuel receipts, lease agreements, load manifests, and bank statements until the lies in them stood up and introduced themselves. Ackland Freight was real. It hauled real freight for real customers. It also, roughly 1 week in 5, hauled a cash consignment north for a network that the Justice Department had labeled, in its own dry way, a professional money laundering organization. The DEA knew. The DEA let it run. And they put a cost analyst inside so somebody could watch every dollar cross the state line and write down where it went. 11 years. $406 million traced. 9 indictments he never got credit for, because his name never appeared on a single one. There were 3 things Thayer Rowe carried that nobody in Danforth knew about. The first was a habit. He memorized rooms. Not consciously, not anymore. He'd walk into a diner and know without deciding to know how many exits there were, which one was chained, and which booth put his back to brick. The second was a piece of training from a 2-week course in Virginia 12 years earlier, taught by a man who had spent 4 years working cartel logistics in Michoacan. It was a nasty little skill, and Thayer had practiced it exactly 11 times in 12 years. Always alone, always in a bathroom with the fan running. You brace the base of your thumb against something solid, and you drive your hand down and out, and the joint pops out of its socket, and your hand goes soft and narrow, and for about 90 seconds your hand is smaller than the loop around it. It hurts in a way that makes your eyes water and your stomach turn over. Then you put it back. The third thing he carried was his belt. It was a plain brown leather belt, 40 inches, worn pale at the 3rd hole. The buckle was a solid brass rectangle with a small raised seam along the bottom edge. If you pressed the seam inward and held it for 4 seconds, a lithium cell in the buckle's core sent a short encrypted burst to a repeater on the water tower at Ackland Freight, and that repeater relayed it to a server in St. Louis, and that server woke up the phone of a woman named Wallace Iverson. It was a duress beacon. He had worn it every day for 6 years and never pressed it once. Special Agent Wallace Iverson was 47, built like a cross-country coach, and had been Thayer's partner since his 3rd year in the division. She had a standing rule about the beacon, that she repeated whenever they had a beer, which was maybe twice a year. Any hour, she'd say. Any reason. If you press that thing because a raccoon scared you in the garage, I will drive out there and shoot the raccoon and never mention it again. Noted, Thayer would say. I mean it, Rowe. Vanity kills quiet men. You'll sit there thinking you can handle it because you've always handled it. Their group supervisor, Anita Salinas, was less sentimental. She'd been running the financial team for 9 years and had the specific patience of someone who had watched a lot of loud arrests produce nothing and a lot of boring paperwork produce 20-year sentences. You are the most valuable thing we have in that county, she told him once, because nobody has ever wondered about you. The day somebody wonders about you, you tell me. Not later. That day. He said he would. He was wrong about who would wonder, and he was wrong about why. Thayer had married Vivienne Adair 9 years earlier, in a courthouse in St. Louis, on a Tuesday, because a Tuesday was cheaper. She was 32 then, a surgical device sales rep with a company car, and a laugh you could hear across a parking lot. He had met her at a hospital fundraiser he'd attended for exactly one reason, which was that a bellwether capital partner was on the host committee, and Thayer had wanted to see the man's shoes. She had walked up to him at the bar, looked at his brown belt and his short-sleeved shirt, and said, "You look like the only person here who isn't performing." At the time, he thought that was the nicest thing anyone had ever said to him. For 6 years, it worked. It worked because she liked steady, and he was extremely good at appearing steady, and because on the nights when he came home from St. Louis at 2 in the morning with his jaw set, she didn't ask, and he was grateful. And gratitude can look a great deal like love if the light is dim enough. Year 7, the light came up. It came up slowly, in the way of most marriages that end without a single dramatic event. She started saying the word boring out loud, in company, with a laugh attached, so that it could be taken as affection. Thayer's idea of a big weekend is reconciling the checkbook. Everyone would smile. He would smile. She started to hate the sedan. She started to hate the belt. "You have worn that belt since I met you," she said one morning, in the kitchen, with real anger in it, which surprised them both. "Every day, the same one. It works," he said. "That's what you say about everything." Here is the cruel part of a cover identity that nobody in the training pipeline ever warns you about. Thayer Rowe could not defend himself. He could not say, "I am not a boring man. I am a man carrying a secret with both hands, and the boredom is the load-bearing wall." He had signed papers about that. So he stood in his kitchen and let his wife describe him as a man with no interior life, and he agreed with her, and every time he agreed with her it became slightly more true in the room, and slightly more of a wound. By the spring of the 9th year, they were living like polite roommates with a shared mortgage. And in April, on a Thursday, somebody kicked in the back door of a house 2 streets over and took a television and a jewelry box, and the county sent a detective around the neighborhood to ask if anyone had seen anything. That was how Detective Sergeant Conrad Deverell came to be standing in Thayer Rowe's kitchen, drinking his coffee, looking at his wife. Deverell was 52, silver at the temples, wide through the shoulders, with the easy, unhurried manner of a man who has spent 2 decades being the calmest person at the worst moment of a stranger's life. He had been with the Cargill County Sheriff's Office for 22 years, the last 20 in major case, and for most of that time he had been the primary death investigator for the entire county. If somebody died in Cargill County in a way that wasn't a hospital bed, Conrad Deverell processed the scene. He was, genuinely, good at it. That was the part people got wrong later. He wasn't a fool who got lucky. He was an expert. He shook Thayer's hand and said, "You're the numbers guy over at Ackland. My brother-in-law drives for you all. I mostly count the fuel," Thayer said. Deverell laughed, a warm, easy laugh, and turned to Vivienne and said, "Ma'am, if you hear anything at all, in the next few nights, you call me direct, not dispatch, me." He gave her a card. Thayer noticed the card. He noticed the way Deverell's thumb had covered the office number and left the cell exposed. He noticed and he filed it, because filing things was what he did, and then he went to work and stared at a shipping manifest for 11 hours and did not think about it again for 4 months. He would think about it, later, every single day for a year. There is a version of Conrad Deverell's life that reads like a decent man's. He grew up in Danforth. went to the high school, joined the sheriff's office at 29 after 7 years selling insurance, which is a detail that mattered enormously and which nobody flagged for 2 decades. He was good with families. He would sit with a mother on a porch step for 3 hours. He taught a class at the community college on evidence documentation. Twice, he had testified for the defense in cases where he believed the state had it wrong, which had cost him a promotion and earned him a reputation for integrity that he then spent 20 years using as a coat. In 2011, his first wife, Ilsa Deverell, drowned in 4 feet of water in a farm pond behind their property. She had a blood alcohol level of 0.14. There was no note, and there didn't need to be, because it was an accident. Conrad Deverell was not the investigating officer, obviously. A man can't work his own wife's death. But the deputy who caught the call had been on the job 8 months and had never processed a drowning. And Deverell was standing right there, and he was the county's death investigator, and so he walked the young man through it. Step by step, kindly. Where to photograph, what to bag, what didn't need bagging. The policy on Ilsa paid $400,000 in 9 weeks. There was no reason for anyone to look at it. That's the thing about a man who teaches the evidence documentation class. Nobody audits the auditor. Not for 20 years. Not until an accountant in a brown belt got curious. The affair started in August, and Thayer Rowe told herself for a long time that it wasn't an affair. It was a friendship with a person who found her interesting. He called about the burglary case twice, which was 2 more times than the case deserved. He asked her about her work. He remembered the names of the surgeons she sold to. When she said something funny, he didn't just laugh. He repeated it later, which is a small trick, and a devastating one. By September, they were meeting for coffee in Eureka, which is far enough from Danforth that nobody would see. By October, it was a room at a chain hotel off the interstate, paid in cash, and Vivian was 41 years old and driving home at 11 at night, feeling 26. Her sister, Soline Adair, who was 34 and lived in Kirkwood and had never liked Thayer particularly, was the only person she told. "He's a cop," Soline said. "He's a detective. He's a 52-year-old cop, and you're married. Thayer doesn't notice anything," Vivian said. Thayer wouldn't notice if the house burned down as long as somebody filed the receipt. Soline remembered that sentence later. She remembered it in an interview room with a recorder running, and she said it out loud, and then she put her face in her hands. Here is what Vivian wanted, and it's important to be fair about it, because the story doesn't work if you make her a cartoon. She wanted out. That's all, at first. She wanted a divorce, and she wanted the house, which was in Thayer's name because he'd bought it 4 years before they married, and she wanted not to go back to the apartment life she'd clawed out of in her 20s. She was 41, and her company had just restructured her territory and cut her base, and she had $11,000 in savings and a car she didn't own. It was Deverell who did the arithmetic out loud, not her. They were in the hotel room in November, and she was crying about a lawyer's retainer, and he lay on his back with his hands behind his head and said, in the same warm, patient, unhurried voice he used on grieving mothers, "Divorce is the expensive way. There's a cheap way." She laughed. She actually laughed, because she thought he was joking, and he let her laugh, and then he didn't say anything for about 11 seconds, and the room changed temperature. "Conrad, 20 years, he said. "I've stood in 600 rooms where somebody died. You know what I've learned? A scene tells you a story, and the story is whatever the first person through the door decides it is." What he did over the next 4 months was not seduction, and it was not coercion exactly. It was onboarding. He was a man who had spent 7 years selling insurance and 20 years managing the emotions of people in shock, and he ran Thayer Rowe through a process the way a good closer runs a hesitant buyer, and every step was small enough that she could say yes to it without feeling like she'd said yes to the thing at the end. Step 1, in December, was a conversation about how much Thayer's life insurance paid. She didn't know. She looked. It was $500,000 through his employer. Step 2, in January, was Deverell mentioning, casually, that employer coverage is garbage and any adult with a mortgage should carry more, and that a spouse can absolutely help set that up. In February, Vivian sat at the kitchen table with Thayer and a folder and said, "I did a thing, don't be annoyed," and had him sign a supplemental term policy for $1.5 million. And Thayer, who was 2 days into a forensic reconciliation of a bellwether shell company and had slept 9 hours and 3 nights, signed it without reading past the premium. That is the single stupidest thing Thayer Rowe has ever done, and he will tell you so himself. Step 3, in March, was the notebook. Deverell asked her to start collecting Thayer's handwriting. Not photographs of it, the real thing, grocery lists, the margins of the crossword, a birthday card, anything with the loops and the pressure and the slant. Why? Because everybody remembers the note, Deverell said. Nobody remembers anything else. A family will forgive 100 details that don't fit if the note is right. The note is the whole case. And step 4 was the thing he never explained to her, and the reason she is serving 22 years while believing, to this day, that she was the one running the plan. In late March, Conrad Deverell took a phone call in a parking lot in Valley Park from a man he had never met, and after that call, the price of Thayer Rowe's death stopped being $1.5 million in insurance money and started being something else entirely. Because somebody at Bellwether Capital Partners had finally noticed that the sleepy cost analyst at Ackland Freight had, over 11 years, requested 340 documents he had no operational reason to request. Thayer noticed things, and this is the part that haunted him afterward. He noticed all of it, and he read all of it wrong. He noticed that his fountain pen, a cheap steel lamy he'd used for a decade, had moved from the left side of the desk blotter to the right. He noticed that the top sheet of the legal pad in the study had been torn off, and that the sheet underneath carried the ghost of pressure marks, and that when he tilted it to the window, the marks were the shape of his own name, written over and over. He stood there with that pad in his hand for a full minute, and then he decided that his wife had been practicing his signature because she was planning to move money out of their joint account before filing for divorce. That is a completely rational conclusion. It is the conclusion 999 men out of 1,000 would reach. It fit everything he already believed, that his marriage was ending, that she resented him, that money was the fight. He did what an auditor does. He quietly moved $11,000 into an account she didn't know about, set a text alert on every card, and felt grimly competent about it. He noticed the county cruiser too, 3 nights in a row in April, parked on Wexler Street where the streetlight was out, at 11:40, 11:50, 11:20. He wrote the times in the back of his work notebook because he wrote everything in the back of his work notebook. He decided it was a patrol pattern. He noticed that Vivian had stopped fighting with him. That, more than anything, should have been the alarm. People don't stop fighting when they're leaving. They fight harder because they're building a case in their own head. Vivian had gone gentle. She made pot roast. She asked about his day and listened to the answer. In the second week of May, she put her hand on the back of his neck while he was reading and said, "You're a good man, Thayer." And he felt something in his chest crack open, because he had been starving for 8 months and he hadn't let himself know it. She was saying goodbye. He thought she was coming back. Wallace Iverson asked him about it on the 14th of May, in the parking garage under the field office, because Wallace Iverson had known him for 8 years and could read his face like a fuel log. Something's wrong at home. Something's been wrong at home for a year. Different wrong. He shrugged. She's being nice to me. Wallace was quiet for a second too long. Rowe, you want me to run her? And here is the moment. Here is the actual hinge of this entire story. The one Thayer thinks about at 3 in the morning. He said no. He said no because running your own wife through federal databases is a fireable offense and a career ender, and, more than that, because it was undignified. Because a man who has spent 11 years being trusted with other people's secrets does not repay a marriage that's dying by pulling his wife's phone records. Because he thought that would make him the villain. No, he said. It's a marriage, Wallace. Not a case. She looked at him for a while. Then she said, "You've got the belt on?" He tapped the buckle. "Okay," she said. "Okay." 11 days later, he woke up on the basement floor. The last thing Thayer Rowe remembered about Tuesday the 25th of May was that the wine was good, and he had said so. Vivian had cooked. She'd opened a bottle of red she'd bought at a place in Webster Groves, and she'd poured his glass first, and hers second, and they'd eaten at the table instead of in front of the television, and she'd asked him about a thing he'd mentioned 3 weeks earlier, which meant she'd remembered it, and he'd thought, with a kind of exhausted hope, maybe we're not done. He got about 2/3 of the way down the glass before the room tilted. He remembers standing up. He remembers his hand missing the back of the chair by 4 inches, and the surprise of that, the sheer mechanical wrongness of his own arm. He remembers Vivian's face, and this is the detail that he has never been able to get out of his head, because her face wasn't cruel, it was frightened, and it was sad, and she said, "Oh," very quietly, like something had gone wrong that she'd hoped wouldn't. Then the floor. He came back in pieces. Cold first, the specific cold of a poured concrete slab through a dress shirt. Then the smell of the basement, laundry detergent and dust, and the iron smell of the sump pit. Then pain in his shoulders, deep and dull, because his arms were behind him, and they'd been behind him a long time. His wrists were zip-tied. Not to anything, just to each other, wrapped twice and pulled to the stop. His ankles were tied at the crossing, one heavy commercial-grade tie. There was a strip of gray duct tape over his mouth, applied badly, curling at one corner. He did not move. He did not open his eyes all the way. That was 11 years of training and 1 lifetime of temperament. Before you do anything, know the room. He counted. His own breathing, first, until it slowed. Then he listened. Voices above him. 2. The kitchen, directly over the northwest corner of the basement, where the floor joists carried sound like a drumhead. He'd complained about that acoustic for years. He'd never once been grateful for it until that moment. Glass on glass. A bottle set down on the counter. And then his wife's voice, light and warm, the way she sounded at parties. Read it to me again. A man's voice. Unhurried. Patient. The voice of somebody who has never once had to raise it. My last note, Deverell read, to whoever finds this. I've been carrying something for a long time, and I don't have anywhere left to set it down. Please tell Viv it isn't her fault. It was never her fault. Thayer. Silence for a second. Then Vivian, softly. Your handwriting's perfect, baby. It's his handwriting, Deverell said. That's the point. On the concrete, in the dark, Thayer Rowe stopped feeling cold. 20 years processing scenes, Deverell went on. I know what they look for. They look for hesitation marks. They look for the note being too long. Real ones are short, real ones are apologies, not explanations. They look for the pen. The pen has to be his pen, and it has to be the one on the desk, and it has to have his prints, and only his prints, which is why we don't touch it, and he does. And the tape? Comes off before. Everything comes off before. There's nothing on him but him. A pause. Then Vivian laughed. A real laugh, delighted. The laugh he'd heard across a parking lot 9 years ago, and said, the accountant finally balanced his own books. That was the moment. Not the note, not the tape, not the poison in the wine or the ties on his wrists. The laugh. Because in 11 years of reading other people's ledgers, Thayer Rowe had learned exactly one thing about human beings that never failed him, and it was this. People are careful about what they say, and careless about what they enjoy. You can lie in a statement. You cannot fake a laugh. She enjoyed it. Something in him went very quiet and very cold and very organized, and stayed that way for the next 11 months. He inventoried himself the way he'd inventory a warehouse. Hands, behind, tied, wrapped twice, no slack. Feet, crossed, one tie, tight enough to be numb. Mouth, taped, but the tape was curling and he could work it against his shoulder. Head, swimming, mouth dry, heart slow. Whatever she'd put in the wine was a sedative, not a poison. They needed him alive and unmarked, because a hanging or a bathtub or a garage full of exhaust requires a living body to do the dying. That was the first piece of good news. They needed him breathing. Pockets, empty. They'd taken his phone and his wallet and his keys. They had not taken his belt. Of course they hadn't. Who takes a man's belt? You take his belt if you're booking him into a cell. You don't take his belt if you're staging a suicide, because a man who hangs himself is wearing his clothes. Thayer Rowe lay in the dark on his own basement floor and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, they've made their first mistake, and it's a big one, and there will be others. Upstairs they kept talking, and because he was still, and because he did not panic, and because the northwest joists carried sound like a drumhead, he heard the thing that changed the shape of the rest of his life. Vivian, from further away, near the sink. How long? 2 hours. For it to fully take. We go down at 1. It's done by 1:15. And after? After, I call it in myself. I'm on rotation. I'll be the primary. A pause. Then Vivian. And there was something new in her voice. A thinness. A first crack. Conrad. The money. You said 90 days. The policy'll pay in 60. No. I mean, the other. What you said in the car. And Deverell said, very quietly, in a tone Thayer had never heard from him, don't. You said somebody was paying you. You said, I said don't. Is it more than the policy? Silence. Then Deverell, flat. It's 400,000, and it's not from anybody you'll ever meet. And the name Novak does not come out of your mouth again. Not to me. Not to your sister. Not out loud in an empty room. Do you understand me? Novak. Thayer lay in the dark with duct tape across his mouth and his hands tied behind him, and something enormous rearranged itself in his chest. Pascal Novak was 60 years old, had a corner office on the 11th floor of a building on Clayton Road, sat on 2 hospital boards, and was the managing partner of Bellwether Capital Partners. Thayer had been reading the man's paper trail for 6 years. Bellwether was the American face of a laundering architecture that moved cash for a trafficking network out of Sinaloa. Trucking, self-storage, car washes, 3 title companies, a chain of physical therapy clinics. Thayer had 411 pages on Pascal Novak that nobody outside a federal building had ever seen. He had never once imagined that Pascal Novak had a single page on him, but of course he did. Because 11 years is a long time, and 340 document requests is a lot of curiosity from a man who counts fuel. And somewhere in an office on Clayton Road, a compliance analyst with too much time had run a pattern and found a shape, and the shape was a person. This wasn't a wife who wanted out. This was a contract, and his wife was the delivery mechanism, and she didn't even know it. She thought she was the author. She was a tool being used by a man who was himself a tool, and the $400,000 was not a bonus on top of the insurance. It was the actual reason. The insurance was the story you tell the tool so the tool believes it's a person. Thayer Rowe felt, for about 4 seconds, something close to pity. Then he got to work. The thumb first, because it was the hardest, and because his hands would not get less numb. He rolled onto his right side, brought his bound wrists down against the base of the wall where the slab met the block, and found the corner of the sump pit cover with his left thumb. Cast iron, 90 degrees, immovable. He set the base of the thumb against it. He breathed out all the way, and he drove his hand down and out. There is no describing it accurately, so here's the closest. It felt like the sound a green branch makes. His vision went white at the edges, and his stomach turned over, and he pressed his face into the concrete and made no noise at all, which is a thing you can do if you have decided in advance that you will. Then his left hand was narrow, and soft, and wrong, and he pulled it through the loop and it came. 16 seconds later, he had his right hand free and his left thumb relocated against the same iron corner. You push it back along the line it came out. You do not yank. And he sat with his back against the block wall in the dark, sweating through his shirt, shaking, with both hands in his lap, and about 90% of a plan. The ankle tie he did with the pocket knife he kept in the toolbox on the 3rd shelf, which they had not thought to check, because they did not know the basement, because it was his basement. 12 minutes past midnight, 48 minutes until they came down. He did not run. Understand, every instinct he had, every animal thing in the base of his skull, was screaming to go out the storm door and across the yard and into the dark. And he stood there at the bottom of his own stairs with his hand on the rail and made himself do the math instead. If he ran, what did he have? A story. A man with a dislocated thumb and a mouthful of sedative tells the county sheriff's office that a 22-year detective, the county's own death investigator, tried to kill him. Who processes that scene? Conrad Deverell. Who does the toxicology go through? The county medical examiner, Rutger Kovac, who had been in Deverell's wedding. Who takes the statement? A deputy who was taught how to take statements by Conrad Deverell. If he ran, he was a paranoid husband in a failing marriage, making an accusation on the same night his wife's boyfriend happened to be in the house. If he ran, the note stayed a piece of paper in a drawer, and it would be in a shredder by breakfast. He needed the note to exist, so he pressed his belt buckle. 4 seconds, the way he'd been taught, the seam going in against his thumbprint and the little dead click of it. He had no way to know if it worked. He'd never pressed it. Then he went up the stairs. Not all the way, 6 steps, until his eye cleared the top of the basement door frame and he could see the crack of light and hear them clearly. He stayed there for 19 minutes, and he listened, and he memorized, and he did the thing that a man who reads ledgers for a living does when he is handed a primary source. He took it in whole. He heard Deverell describe how he would call it in. He heard Deverell say the name of the pharmacy in Fenton where the sedative had come from, and the name on the script. He heard Vivian ask what would happen if the autopsy found the drug, and he heard Deverell say, "Rutger signs what I hand him. He has for 11 years," which was, all by itself, an entire second investigation. He heard Deverell say, "Perry Gantry's wife still sends me a Christmas card," and at 12:31, he went back down and out the basement storm door on the east side, which he had oiled himself in March, and across the side yard below the fence line, and he did not go to a neighbor, and he did not go to the road. He went to the drainage culvert under Wexler Street, where a man could sit in 18 inches of concrete pipe and not be seen from the house, and he sat in it in the dark, with a wrecked thumb and a shirt full of sweat, and he waited to find out whether a belt buckle he'd never tested had told anybody in the world that he was still alive. At 12:52, headlights came down Wexler with no siren and no light bar, moving too slow, and stopped at the culvert mouth, and the driver's window came down, and Wallace Iverson said, in a voice like a wire pulled tight, "Rowe, say something." "Raccoon," he said. She got out of the car. She looked at his thumb, which had already gone purple and the size of a plum, and she looked at his wrists, which were bracelet red and bleeding at the ulnar bone, and she looked at his face. "Who?" she said. "Get me 11 blocks away and I'll tell you everything," Thayer said. "But listen to me first, because in 22 minutes, they're going to go down those stairs and find nothing, and what they do in the 90 seconds after that is the most honest thing either of them will ever do, and there is nobody in that house to see it." Wallace Iverson stared at him. "You want to put eyes on your own house. I want a camera on my own front door," Thayer said, "and I want it there before 1 a.m. They did not get a camera up in time. What they got was better and dumber. Wallace parked on Ridley Court with a long lens and a night body she kept in the trunk for surveillance she wasn't supposed to be doing, and at 1:09 in the morning, she photographed Conrad Deverell coming out of the Rowe residence's front door at a dead run, in gloves, with his phone lit in his hand. Time-stamped, geotagged, a 22-year detective sprinting out of a house where, according to every official record that would exist for the next 11 months, nothing whatsoever had happened. It would take 8 months for anyone but 4 people to understand what that photograph was worth. The St. Louis Field Division at 4 in the morning is a strange place. Half the lights on a timer, the coffee from a machine that has never made good coffee, and a level of quiet you never get during the day. Anita Salinas came in wearing a raincoat over pajama pants and did not comment on it. An emergency room physician had put Thayer's thumb in a splint at a clinic in Valley Park, under a name that was not his, photographed his wrists, and drawn 4 vials of blood, which was the single most important medical procedure of the entire case, and which happened at 3:11 in the morning because Wallace Iverson had insisted on it in the car. "Blood first," she'd said, "before you sleep, before you eat, before you talk. Whatever's in you is leaving you every minute." It was midazolam, a benzodiazepine, hospital grade, the kind used for procedural sedation. Not something you get at a pharmacy counter. Something you get from a person who sells surgical devices to hospitals and has a badge that opens supply rooms. By 5 in the morning, there were 5 people in the small conference room. Thayer, Wallace, Salinas, an assistant United States attorney named Talbot Stanton who had driven in from Webster Groves in a fishing sweatshirt, and a legal pad. Stanton was 41, precise, and had the unpopular habit of telling agents what they didn't have instead of what they did. "Let's do the bad news," he said, "because the bad news is most of the news," he wrote as he talked. 1. You have no note. You saw no note. You heard a man read words aloud. That's hearsay from a witness with a motive, and the witness is the alleged victim, and the alleged victim is going through a divorce. We're not going through. You will be, and a defense attorney will call it that anyway. 2. You have zip ties you can't produce, because they're in a trash bag in a truck by now. 3. You have injuries entirely consistent with self-infliction, which is exactly what they will say. And here's the ugly part, Agent Rowe. You dislocated your own thumb. On purpose. You will have to explain that to a jury, and the other side gets to say the words, "He did this to himself," and point at your hand. Nobody said anything. 4. Stanton said, "The toxicology is real, and it's good, but it proves you were drugged. It doesn't prove who. Your wife will say you took something." 5. He put the pen down. The scene is in Cargill County, which means the crime is his jurisdiction. The evidence goes to his lab. The death investigator is him, and the medical examiner is his friend of 11 years. If we arrest tonight, everything that would ever have proven this walks out of that house in a gym bag before the sun comes up. Selena said, "So what do we have?" "You have," Stanton said, "a photograph of a detective running out of a house at 1:09 in the morning, and a name, Novak." Thayer had said the name once, at 3:40 in the morning, in the car, and Wallace Iverson had pulled over onto the shoulder of Highway 44 and put the hazards on and sat there for a full minute with her hands on the wheel. Because if Pascal Novak had paid for this, then this was not a domestic. It was a hit on a federal agent by a laundering organization, ordered because the agent had gotten close, and that meant two things at once. It meant the danger was real and ongoing and would not stop because Thayer had gotten out of a basement. And it meant that Conrad Deverell, a 22-year county detective with an unblemished record and a reputation for integrity, had been on somebody's payroll for long enough to be trusted with a job like this. You do not hire a stranger to kill a federal agent. You hire the man who has already done work for you. Which raised a question that Thayer Rowe asked out loud at 5:15 in the morning in a conference room in St. Louis, and which turned this from a case about one night into a case about 20 years. "What else," he said, "has that man already done?" Here is where the story stops being about escape and starts being about the actual weapon Thayer Rowe carried. They could have arrested. Stanton could have taken the toxicology and the photograph to a grand jury in 10 days and gotten an indictment for attempted murder, probably. Maybe a conviction, maybe not. 60-40, Stanton said, and Thayer would have spent a year on a witness stand explaining his own thumb. Thayer said no. He stood up, and he walked to the whiteboard, and he did the only thing he had ever been good at. "For 11 years, he said, "I've been told my job is boring. I want to explain why it isn't. A man can control a room. Conrad Deverell can walk into any room in Cargill County where somebody has died and decide what that room means. He is genuinely the best in the state at it. I am not going to beat him in a room." He drew a line down the middle of the board. But a room is a moment. Money is a record. Every dollar that moves has two ends, and the man who moved it only controls one of them. He can burn the note. He cannot burn the fact that his checking account received $400,000, because that fact lives in a bank he doesn't own, in a system he can't touch, in a country with a Bank Secrecy Act. He wrote 3 words on the board: "Follow the paper." He's a homicide detective. He knows how homicide detectives are caught, and he built a career on making sure he never leaves what they look for. He has never in his life thought about how a forensic accountant catches somebody. He has no idea what I look for. He tapped the board. "So we don't chase him. We audit him," Selena said, slowly. "That's a year. It's 11 months, Thayer said. And it starts with the fact that as of about an hour ago, I'm missing. Because that was the other thing. At 1:09, Conrad Deverell had run out of that house knowing his target was gone. By 3 in the morning, he'd have made 2 calls. By 6, he'd have decided what story to tell. And the story he had to tell, the only one available to him, was that Thayer Rowe had vanished, which meant Conrad Deverell was going to have to open a missing persons investigation into a man he had tried to murder. And he was going to have to run it himself, because he could not let anyone else run it. And every single thing he did to make that story hold together was going to be an official act, logged, time-stamped, and preserved by the very county system he trusted. "He's going to build our case for us," Thayer said, "because he can't help it. It's what he's good at." Stanton looked at him for a long moment. "You want to stay dead. I want to stay missing," Thayer said. "There's a difference, and it's about 60 days. And it's the difference between a man who's careful and a man who's relieved. The Cargill County Sheriff's Office opened case number 25-1147 on the 26th of May at 10:40 in the morning. Rowe, Thayer M., white male, 44. Last seen at his residence on Wexler Street. Detective Sergeant Conrad Deverell assigned it to himself. Over the following 11 weeks, he did the following things, all of which were logged. He documented the scene at the Rowe residence himself, alone, photographing 41 images. He collected, as evidence, one yellow legal pad from the study desk, one Lamy fountain pen, and one handwritten note found in the top right desk drawer. He entered the note into evidence. He entered it because he had to. Because Vivian Rowe had already told a neighbor at 8 in the morning that her husband had been in a dark place. And because if a note existed and was never logged and later turned up, it would end him. Because a detective who finds a suicide note in a missing person's desk and does not book it is a detective who is hiding something. So Conrad Deverell, on the 26th of May at 11:52 a.m., placed a forgery he had written with his own hand into the permanent evidentiary custody of the Cargill County Sheriff's Office, under his own signature, with his own case number, and he had no choice. And Thayer Rowe had known he'd have no choice at 12:20 the previous morning, while sitting on his own basement stairs. That is what it means to audit somebody. The lab tech who received item 4, one sheet of yellow legal paper, handwritten, 22 words, was a 29-year-old named Corinna Ledoux. Corinna had been at the Cargill County Crime Lab for 3 years. She had a chemistry degree from Mizzou, a small apartment, a cat named Bailey, and a very specific personality trait, which was that she could not leave an inconsistency alone. It had made her difficult in school and excellent at her job. She noticed something about item 4 on her second day with it, and she did not report it, because the thing she noticed didn't make sense and she assumed she'd made an error. The ghost impressions. A sheet torn from a legal pad carries indentations from the sheet above it. Standard analysis, electrostatic detection, first-year stuff. She ran it out of habit. And the sheet from the Rowe desk drawer carried indentations, but the indentations were not from a grocery list or a phone number. They were the same 22 words, written at least 4 times, with variations. I've been carrying something. I've been carrying this a long time. I've been carrying something for a long time, and I don't have anywhere left to set it down. Drafts. Nobody drafts a suicide note 4 times, and then writes the 5th on the same pad and leaves the pad. Corinna Ledoux photographed her results, wrote a 2-page supplemental, and put it in the case file. 6 days later, she pulled the file to add a photograph, and her supplemental was not in it. She stood in the file room for a long time. Then she went back to her bench, opened the drawer where she kept her personal notebook, and started a new page. And at the top of it, she wrote a date and the words, Item 4, Sup, Missing. She would fill 11 pages of that notebook over the next 9 months. It is currently Exhibit 41 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri. Thayer Rowe spent that summer in a 2-bedroom rental in Maplewood with the blinds down, and he did the work. He had access, through a federal task force subpoena, to 20 years of Cargill County death investigations. 211 cases in which Conrad Deverell had been the primary. He built a spreadsheet. Of course he built a spreadsheet. He did not sort them by anything a detective would sort them by. He did not look at method, or victimology, or geography. He sorted them by a single column that no homicide investigator in America would ever think to create. Days from date of death to date of first insurance disbursement. 211 cases. 204 of them had no payout at all, or a payout inside a normal window. 7 were fast. Then he added a second column. Whether any beneficiary, within 24 months, had opened an account, purchased a property, or made a deposit at an institution serviced by Bellwether Capital Partners or its 3 title companies. 7 became 3. Ilsa Deverell, 2011, Farm Pond, $400,000 in 63 days. The beneficiary, Conrad Deverell, purchased a lake property in Camden County 14 months later, financed through a title company that Thayer had personally documented as a Bellwether laundering node in 2019. Perry Gantry, 2019, 58 years old, a bookkeeper. Found in his garage, car running, a note on the seat. Ruled suicide by Rutger Kovac in under 36 hours. $600,000 in 51 days. Perry Gantry had been, for the 4 years before he died, the outside accountant for 2 of Bellwether's physical therapy clinics. Basil Hollowell, 2022, 66, a retired commercial real estate appraiser. Found at the base of a limestone bluff on his own property. No note. His family said he'd been depressed since a hip surgery. Ruled undetermined/probable suicide. $800,000, split, in 44 days. Basil Hollowell had signed appraisals on 11 properties, and in 2021 he had refused to sign the 12th. 3 deaths across 11 years. 3 men who had, in different small ways, been in a position to notice what an organization was doing with its money. 3 scenes processed by the same expert. 3 death certificates signed by the same medical examiner. And in all 3, an insurance payment that arrived faster than paperwork usually moves. Conrad Deverell was not a corrupt cop who had taken a bribe. He was a service. He had been, for at least 14 years, the piece of the machine that made inconvenient people stop being a problem in a way that closed cleanly. Thayer printed the 3-page summary at 11 at night in a rented room in Maplewood, and then he sat with his hands flat on the table and did not move for a long time, because there was a 4th column he had not built yet, and he knew what it would say. He built it anyway. Column 4. What did Conrad Deverell do in the 8 weeks before each death? In all 3 cases, he took a class. Continuing education, department funded, at the community college or the state academy. Bloodstain interpretation. Digital device forensics. Question document examination. He studied for them. He prepared. He was, right to the end, a professional who believed in doing the work properly. Thayer Rowe read that and felt the cold thing in his chest turn all the way over, and he understood that he was not going to be able to do this halfway. Wanda Gantry was 63 years old and lived in a ranch house in Danforth with a screened porch and a dog named Pepper, and she still sent Conrad Deverell a Christmas card every year, because in the worst week of her life, he had sat on that porch with her for 3 hours and made her eat a sandwich. Wallace Iverson knocked on her door in September. It took 2 hours to get to the part that mattered, and the part that mattered was this. Perry Gantry had, 11 days before he died, come home and told his wife that he'd found something at work that was either a mistake or the kind of thing you go to prison over, and that he was going to talk to somebody about it. Did he say who? He said a detective he knew from the Rotary, Wanda said. He said, "At least I know one honest cop." She was quiet for a while after she said it. Then she said, "You're going to tell me something now, aren't you?" Wallace Iverson, who had done this 11 times in her career and had never gotten better at it, said, "Yes, ma'am." Wanda Gantry got up and went into the kitchen and came back with a shoebox, and in it were 14 Christmas cards she had received back from Conrad Deverell over 6 years, every one of them signed by hand. "Take these," she said. "I don't want them in my house." Handwriting exemplars, 6 years of them, in a shoebox, freely given, with a chain of custody a defense attorney could not touch. It was the single best piece of evidence in the entire case, and it came from a woman who had spent 6 years thanking the man who killed her husband. Soline Adair broke in October, and she broke because of the least dramatic thing imaginable, a bank statement. Vivian had asked her sister, back in April, to accept a wire of $18,000 and hold it, just for a couple months, until the account stuff settles. Soline had said yes, because sisters say yes. When Thayer's disappearance hit the 2nd month, and then the 3rd, and Vivian stopped talking about him at all, Soline started to feel something she couldn't name, and she looked up the wire's originating account, and it wasn't Vivian's. It was an entity called Meridian Row Consulting LLC. She typed it into a search bar at 11 at night. It was registered at an address in Clayton, on the 11th floor. Soline Adair called the FBI tip line because she didn't know who else to call, and the tip routed to St. Louis, and 41 hours later, she was sitting across from Wallace Iverson and Anita Salinas, in a room with a recorder running, saying, "He's alive, isn't he? Please tell me he's alive." They didn't tell her. They asked her to keep having lunch with her sister, once a week, the way she always had, and to wear a small device. and to not be clever, and to never once ask a question she wouldn't have asked in April. She did it for 4 months. She lost 11 pounds. In February, at a restaurant in Kirkwood, over a salad, Thayer Rowe said the following sentence, which is now 9 seconds of audio that was played twice at trial. "I keep thinking somebody's going to knock on the door, and then I remember Conrad did it right. He did everything right. It's just the one thing he can't fix. And the one thing is that there's no body. And he says without a body it's just a sad man who walked off. And sad men walk off every day." Then she said, "I miss him sometimes. Isn't that stupid?" And her sister, wearing a wire, said, "No, that's not stupid." Lieutenant Junia Cabrera ran the major case unit and had been Conrad Deverell's supervisor, on paper, for 6 years, which is a job description she described later as signing what he handed me. Anita Salinas approached her in November, off-site, at a diner in Pacific, and put 4 photographs on the table, the running man at 109, and 3 death certificates. Cabrera looked at them for a long time. Then she said something that Salinas repeated in her report, and that Stanton put in his opening statement. "I have wondered about that man for 9 years, Lieutenant Cabrera said. And every single time I wondered, I decided it was because I was jealous of how good he was." She gave them the department, everything, the evidence room logs, the badge swipe records, the internal photo log metadata, the whole system. And she did one more thing, which was to make sure nobody in that building knew she'd done it, which is how, on the 9th of March, the trap was ready, and it had 2 jaws, and the beautiful thing about it was that Conrad Deverell was going to close both of them himself. The first jaw was money, and it was Thayer's, and it was the most elegant thing he ever did in 11 years of federal service. He did not steal anything, and he did not forge anything, and this matters, because Talbot Stanton would not have allowed a single dollar to move improperly. What he did was smaller and worse. Bellwether Capital Partners moved cash through a set of 9 shell entities, and the reconciliation between those entities was done quarterly by a compliance analyst on the 9th floor using a set of intercompany transfer memos. Thayer had been reading those memos for 6 years. He knew their format, their rhythm, their sloppy habits. He knew that Entity 4 routinely double-booked freight settlements and that nobody had ever caught it because nobody was reading. So the task force, with a court order, did 2 entirely lawful things. They seized $410,000 sitting in an account controlled by Meridian Row Consulting LLC, the entity that had paid Conrad Deverell, a seizure warrant, public record, eventually, but not for 90 days, and they served a grand jury subpoena on the bank that held Bellwether's operating account, requesting records for a 2-year window. That's all. 2 ordinary federal actions. But here is what those 2 actions looked like from the 11th floor of a building on Clayton Road. $410,000, sent to a contractor for a job that had not been completed, had vanished, and a federal grand jury had, 3 days later, started asking a bank about the account it came out of. Pascal Novak, 60 years old, hospital boards, corner office, did the only arithmetic available to him. The contractor had failed. The contractor had then either taken the money and run, or, worse, far worse, the contractor had been picked up and had traded the money and the story for himself. He never had to believe Deverell flipped, Thayer said later. He only had to be unable to prove he hadn't. That's all a suspicion is. It's an unbalanced line. Novak sent a man to Danforth. The second jaw was the note, and it was Deverell's, and he walked into it on his own 2 feet at 2:11 in the morning on the 12th of March. Because when a man like Conrad Deverell starts to feel the ground move, he does not run and he does not panic. He goes back to the one loose piece he has never been able to sleep about, and he tidies it. Item 4, Case 25-1147. 1 sheet of yellow legal paper, in an evidence envelope, in a locker on the 2nd floor of the Cargill County Sheriff's Office, with his signature on the seal. He had a legitimate reason to sign it out. He was the case detective. Nobody would question it, and nobody did. He swiped his badge at the evidence room door at 2:11 a.m., signed the log in his own handwriting, retrieved item 4, and carried it down the hall to the copy room. Lieutenant Junia Cabrera had put a camera in the copy room in January. He is on it for 9 minutes. He opens the envelope. He reads the note, his own note, the one he wrote at Vivienne Rowe's kitchen table 10 months earlier. And he stands there reading it for a long time, and his face does something. Then he takes a fresh sheet of yellow legal paper out of his coat pocket. He had brought a replacement. He had written a new note, shorter, with no drafts behind it, because he had finally realized what Corinna Ledoux's missing supplemental had said, and he was going to swap the evidence for a cleaner forgery and reseal the envelope with a fresh signature and a backdated initial. At 2:20 in the morning, he had one federal felony in his left hand and another in his right, on camera, in the building where he had worked for 22 years. He never got to the sealer. The door opened. They took him in the copy room, and Lieutenant Cabrera did it herself, and she said afterward that the only thing she felt was tired. They took Vivienne Rowe at 6:40 that morning at the house on Wexler Street, in a bathrobe, and she asked whether she could put on real clothes, and a female deputy stood with her while she did. They took Pascal Novak at 9:15 on the 11th floor, and the arrest photograph of him, hands folded, expression pleasant, still in the chair, ran in the Post-Dispatch for 3 days. They took Rutger Kovac at his home in Baldwin. He surrendered his medical license 11 days later and testified for the government in exchange for 8 years. And in Danforth, at 10 past noon, a man from Chicago who had been sent to find Conrad Deverell was arrested in the parking lot of a hardware store on State Highway 30, and in the trunk of his rental car was a printed photograph of a 52-year-old detective and an address that turned out to be a lake property in Camden County, bought with a dead woman's insurance money. That's the part almost nobody knows. Conrad Deverell was arrested at 2:20 in the morning, and by lunchtime the same day, the arrest had saved his life. Thayer Rowe walked into the interview room at 4:15 that afternoon. He had been missing for 290 days. There had been a candlelight thing at the high school. There was a photograph of him on a laminated sign at the Danforth post office. Deverell had been sitting alone for 6 hours with a coffee he hadn't touched. He looked up when the door opened. He did not gasp, and he did not swear. And this is the detail Thayer found most useful about the man, right to the end. Conrad Deverell looked at a man he had drugged and tied and left for dead, walking into a room 300 days later in a splinted and healed left hand and a brown belt, and what he did was smile. Small and rueful and almost warm. The smile of a professional who has just been shown a better play. Well, he said. Thayer sat down across from him and put a single sheet of paper on the table. Not the note, a bank statement. 20 years processing scenes, Thayer said. You told her that. You said you know what they look for. I do. You do, Thayer agreed. You're better at it than anyone I've ever read about. You never left a fiber. You never left a hesitation mark. You thought about the pen. He turned the statement around so it faced the other man. You just never once thought about what happens after. Everything you were paid, somebody had to pay. Every payment had to come out of a book that has to balance. And the whole time you were learning what a homicide detective looks for. He tapped the paper. Nobody ever taught you what an auditor looks for. Conrad Deverell looked down at the sheet for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, it was the pond, wasn't it, Ilse? It was 14 months after the pond, Thayer said. It was the title company, and the county's best death investigator, the man who had sat on 600 porches, put both hands flat on the table, and did not say another word for 11 hours. The indictment ran to 141 pages. Conrad Deverell was convicted on attempted murder of a federal officer, 3 counts of murder in the first degree in state court, forgery, tampering with physical evidence, and 11 federal counts under the racketeering statute. The 3 murders were Ilse Deverell, Perry Gantry, and Basil Hollowell. He is serving life without parole at a facility in Bonne Terre, and he has never given a statement, and he has never asked to. Vivienne Rowe pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and to a federal count of solicitation, and she received 22 years. At her sentencing, she read a letter out loud that was mostly about how she had been manipulated, and the judge listened to all of it, and then said one sentence before he imposed the term, "Ma'am, you laughed." Pascal Novak was convicted of money laundering conspiracy, murder for hire, and the operation of a continuing financial criminal enterprise, and received 41 years. Bellwether Capital Partners was dissolved. $390 million in assets across 4 states were seized. 9 other people went to prison, including 2 men Thayer Rowe had been reading about for 6 years and had never seen in person until he sat behind them in a courtroom. Rutger Kovac got 8 years and lost his license. 211 Cargill County death investigations were reopened. 19 death certificates were amended. One of the amended certificates went to a ranch house in Danforth with a screened porch. It said that Perry Gantry, 58, had died by homicide, and Wanda Gantry framed it, which is a strange thing to do, and which she explained by saying, "It's the first true thing anybody official ever said about my husband." Corinna Ledoux testified for 2 days. She was 29 years old. She had never been in a federal courtroom. And when defense counsel asked her why she had kept a private notebook rather than reporting through her chain of command, she said, "Because the chain of command was one guy, and the missing document had his name on the intake." She runs the question documents section now. Her cat is still named Bailey. Lieutenant Junia Cabrera was made a captain, then quit 14 months later and took a job teaching at a police academy in Rolla. She teaches one class that isn't in the standard curriculum. It's called Supervising the Expert. Soline Adair has not spoken to her sister since the sentencing. She writes to her once a month and does not send the letters. She was the government's second witness, and she cried through most of it, and she never once changed her story. Wallace Iverson still keeps a night camera in her trunk, and she still isn't supposed to. Thayer Rowe's cover was gone the moment he walked into that interview room, and he knew it walking in. 11 years of being nobody, spent in a single afternoon to make a 52-year-old man put his hands flat on a table. He was asked, at the debrief, whether he regretted it, whether he'd have preferred to stay in the field, keep the beige office, keep counting fuel. He said no, and then he said something that Anita Salinas has quoted in every recruiting talk she's given since. "There is nothing more dangerous in this country." He said, "than a man everybody has agreed is above being checked. Not a violent man, a trusted one. The whole system runs on the assumption that somebody, at some point, opened the file and read it, and most of the time, nobody has." He does not work cases anymore. He teaches financial investigations at the DEA Training Academy in Quantico, Virginia, 3 sections a year, and every class starts the same way. He puts a spreadsheet on the screen with 211 rows and asks the room which column matters. Nobody ever gets it. The house on Wexler Street was sold. He kept 2 things out of it. One was a Lamy fountain pen, because it was returned to him from evidence and it seemed like bad luck to throw it away. The other is a brown leather belt, 40 inches, worn pale at the 3rd hole, with a brass buckle that has a small raised seam along the bottom edge. It's in a shadow box on his office wall in Virginia. There's a strip of engraved brass under it. It doesn't say anything about the case. It says, "Press it early." So that's the whole thing, from the floor of the basement to a shadow box on a wall in Virginia. I've had a long time to think about which mistake was the real one, and I'll tell you, it wasn't the wine and it wasn't the marriage. It was the 60 seconds in February when a woman I trusted put a folder in front of me at the kitchen table and said, "Don't be annoyed," and I signed a $1.5 million life insurance policy on myself without reading past the premium line. I was tired. It seemed like a boring piece of paper. That's the whole trick, by the way. The paperwork that kills people never looks urgent. So here is the thing I actually want you to do. And it costs nothing, and it takes about 5 minutes. Call the company that holds any life insurance policy with your name on it, including the one through your job, and ask them for 2 specific things. First, ask for a complete policy change history, every change to coverage amount, ownership, and beneficiary, with dates. They have to give it to you. It's your policy, and most people go their whole lives never once looking at it. Second, ask them to add a third-party notification designee, and put somebody on it who is not in your household, a sibling, an old friend. What that does is simple. From that day forward, if anyone changes your coverage, your ownership, or your beneficiary, a letter goes to a person outside your house, not to the kitchen table where the folder gets slid across. Outside. If Conrad Deverell had known that a letter would land at my sister Bess's apartment in St. Louis the week that policy was written, he'd have picked a different accountant. I'd never have been on that floor. Look, I spent 11 years believing that being underestimated was my armor. It was. It also made me lazy about my own house. because I was so used to being the person reading everybody else's. Be the boring person who reads their own paperwork. Ask for the history. Nobody is ever going to hand it to you. And if you've got somebody in your life who has a thing they always carry, a habit, a routine, a stupid old belt they refuse to replace, don't laugh at it too hard. Sometimes that's the only reason they come home. Thanks for being here. I'm Thayer Rowe. Take care of yourselves.